Hi, my name's Tom Myers, and I've been in private practice in structural bodywork for over 20 years now, and I've been teaching for anatomy for the past 12 years. And this tape on the myofascial meridians is the product of my researches and my attempt to make a holistic anatomy of the myofascia accessible to my students. The information on this tape has proven valuable not only to structural body workers, but to massage therapists of all types, to manual therapists of all types, even chiropractors and physiotherapists, and as well for movement teachers, yoga teachers, dance therapists, and athletic trainers. So we've come out here on the coast of Maine near my home to explain the myofascial meridians. The information on this tape gives you a powerful assessment tool to assess global postural problems and also to figure out how myofascial pain can travel along these meridians of myofascia so that where you end up working can be quite distant from the site of pain itself. It will also increase your 3D understanding of the anatomy of the human body. The information contained on this tape is unique in that, for the first time I think, it really gives you a view of myofascial anatomy that's based on wholes instead of parts. So let's go to the classroom and see how it works. Hi. We're still on the Maine coast actually, but we've moved inside to take advantage of what a classroom can offer, and we're joined by these members of the bodywork community to help us out. First off, before we get started, we need to say something about language. The language that we use these days, ever since Isaac Newton, is really characterized by parts and getting down into the parts. In fact, we've gone from doing anatomy, which is that which cannot be cut, with cleavers and knives, down to doing anatomy with electron microscopes and MRI machines, so that you can go way into smaller and smaller things right in the middle of the cell. But where in the society do you come in and take a look at a person and say, how is this whole system working? How are things hanging together? How is the system integrated? That's what happens in a bodyworker or movement therapist practice, and that's the strength of it. So myofascial work is a very popular way of thinking about the body, and in that everybody says, well, the fascia connects up the whole body. But when you actually come to teach it, what do you get? You get individual muscles. Here's the trigger point for this muscle. Here's a technique for this muscle. What you're going to get on this tape is how to connect all that up. It's not that just this muscle goes from here to here, but this muscle is part of a myofascial meridian that stretches along the front of the arm and connects down into the front of the body. That's what you will get out of this tape. Now, that's an integrated language, a language of wholes, and what that allows us to do is look at relationships going on in the body, rather than a mechanistic if-then kind of protocol, which sounds very powerful. If you have a medial collateral ligament tear, then you do 20 reps on the quad machine 4 times a day. That sounds very powerful. That shoulder isn't relating to that hip. Doesn't sound very powerful, but it is the language of wholes. It's the language of relationship, and that's the language with which we are going to see a new way of working and a comprehensive way of working with the myofasciae. So let's go look at where it came from. Right away here at the beginning, I want to give some credit to Ida Rolf, who is my major teacher and gave me useful work to do that kept me off the streets for the last 20 years. And it's her pioneering work in the myofascial arena, structural integration, that has inspired my going on and developing the myofascial continuities and the anatomy trains. So I have a kind of double thing here of really wanting to acknowledge that she's the source of how I got here, but not wanting to say that this myofascial meridians is Rolfing work per se. In fact, I think the general idea of the myofascial meridians is applicable to the wider realm of bodywork that we have represented here and are represented in our audience. Her idea, her conception, was that if you line up the body as a series of blocks, next slide please, if you conceive of the segments of the body as a series of blocks, that you can line them up and attain an easy natural alignment. And if we could look at the next slide. Here's an example of someone before and after structural integration, and what you can see in terms of the alignment here with the little girl on your left is that, for instance, the knee is well behind the hip. Her knees are forced back, and forcing the knees back forces the pelvis to angle forward and the rib cage to angle back and the neck to angle forward again. So it's kind of zig, zag, zig, zag. And afterwards that she's able to simply stand in an easy upright alignment. And in talking in the terms we're going to use in this videotape, the myofascial meridians around her skeleton are balanced in such a way that that alignment is just part of who she is. That's just how she is now. So now let's think for a minute about the anatomy of wholes, a holistic anatomy. And to do this, we'll conduct a little thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this. Imagine that we could take any of the systems of the body and just bring them out and have them stand here just as they are. And the question that we're going to ask is this: which systems of the body would show us exactly the shape of the whole body? In other words, which are the holistic systems? To help us do this, let's enlist the help of one of my favorite Renaissance heroes, Vesalius, who started doing exactly what I'm talking about. And here's one of his first attempts. This picture of the skeleton is familiar to all school children now, but in its day it was a very radical picture. Nobody had seen the body as if it were alive like this, not the insides of the body anyway. And this picture was about as radical for its day as a picture of the Earth coming back from the moon has been for our day. But anyway, here we see the skeletal system extracted from the body and just standing there. And if we imagine that that happened to everybody in the room, zap, and we're just a bunch of skeletons, it would be really hard to recognize who's who. We might be able to tell female pelvis from a male pelvis and figure out who are the men and the women, but actually there's an overlap between the male and the female pelvis, so really we'd need dental records by the time to be able to figure out who was who. So we'll have to think of another system. So the next system that we could think of that might do this would be the skin. If we suddenly extracted the skin and we had it standing there just as if in life, that would show us the exact shape of the body also, wouldn't it? But that's not really what we want, because that would show us the exact shape of the outside of the body, and what we want to see is the shape of the whole body. So skeleton doesn't work, skin doesn't quite work. Another answer that I get a lot of times is the immune system. In these days of AIDS, we hear a lot about the immune system. But if you think about the immune system, it really goes through all the systems of the body, and it's not really a system that we could take out and look at. It's a function of all the systems. So we talk about the immune system, but we really mean the immune function. I want an artifact. I want something that I can see and feel and touch that stands there and acts like a system. So our first, next slide please. Our first system that really does that, and here again is Vesalius' attempt at this, is the nervous system. So here he added the backbone in here and left out the brain and left out some of the nerves, but you can see the shape of the nervous system showing us the shape of the whole body. In fact, it would be even much, much more detailed than this, because we'd have the whole eye, we'd have all the surface of the skin, but these nerves were too small for Vesalius to dissect out at that time. So what you got here is the major trunks, but I think you can see the idea if we added all the little pea tendrils of nerves that go all over the body. For instance, if you take a quarter and you drop it on the palm of your hand, you're covering about 1,000 nerve endings. If you do that on the middle of your back, somewhere that's less sensitive, you get about 100 nerve endings. But just the same, there's no place on your body that you can't feel if your nerves are working well. So what we'd see would be the exact outline of the body in the nervous system. So that's one, is the nervous system. Next slide, please. The second system that would reveal the exact shape of the whole body is the circulatory system. We could include the blood and the lymph here. What Vesalius has done this time is to include the major blood vessels, the arteries and veins. What he didn't know at the time, it wouldn't be discovered until 200 years later, is that those arteries and veins meet in the capillaries. In fact, if you took all these arteries and all the veins and all the capillaries and strung them together, there would be 60,000 miles or 100,000 kilometers of tubing in each person. So there's an awful lot of tubes to carry the water around from one place to the other inside of us. It would be blood and lymph. And so that system, if we could magically extract it, and it would stay up, which of course it wouldn't if we did it, but if it would stay up there, would show us, again, the exact shape of the body. So we have the nervous system and the circulatory system, and what's the third system that would show us the exact shape of the body? Next slide, please. Well, here again is Vesalius, and this is his attempt kind of to put this third system. What you see here is the muscular system, and the third system that I'm talking about is the fascial system. What you're looking at in the fascia is everything that you don't see in this picture. They flayed off the fascia and left you the muscles. But the fibrous net of the body is, as we'll see in a little bit, a net that covers everything in the body. In fact, if we looked at that fibrous net, there is no place that we could take a piece out of the body except maybe the middle of the blood vessels and not have a piece of that fibrous system. Let's go through a few more Vesalius pictures and just see how this system is arranged. Again, we're looking at the muscles, but if you do a kind of figure ground shift, everything that isn't the muscles is the fascia. So here you can see the fascia from the back, and you can see in the grain of the muscles, that generally also follows the grain of the fascia. We'll be able to see that the fabric of the fascia has a warp and a woof to it, just as fabric does. And the other thing about the way the myofasciae are arranged, because really you can't divorce the muscle and the fascia, they're very much tied together, at least in the musculoskeletal system, what you see is that it's arranged in layers. We're the most complicated piece of origami you've ever seen, and so the myofasciae come in layers, and here you can see some of those layers as we take them off. So here's the next layer down from the back. We see even the deeper muscles of the back and the backs of the legs here. And here we see the front of the body, and I love this picture with the diaphragm nailed to the wall next to him, but being an anatomist, you get to be a connoisseur of old anatomy books because they teach you things that you don't see in the modern ones. For instance, here is a line of fascia that you can see going right up here. We're going to be talking about this connection of myofascia, and it was in this picture that I first spotted it, and you can see it going right up the psoas to the diaphragm there. In order to fully convince you about the unity of this fascial net, I want to take you on a brief journey through the embryology of how the net comes to be. If we look at the fertilized ovum, the first single cell, it's kind of like a water balloon. In fact, the whole structure of human beings could be seen as a series of about 1 trillion water balloons, with the membranes pulling in like the skin of a balloon and the structure in the cell pushing out. That's kind of what we're doing with the myofascial meridians, isn't it? The bones are pushing out and the myofascia is pulling in. Anyway, going back to this fertilized cell, which is a huge cell, if you took a pencil and sharpened it and just dropped it very lightly on a piece of paper, that's how big an ovum is, and that's absolutely huge for a human cell. Anyway, as it gets graduates from the ovary and goes into the fallopian tube, it's covered by a jelly-like coating called the zona pellucida, which keeps it, acts as the membrane when the cell divides, because this cell is going to divide into 2 cells, yeah? And as it divides into 2 cells, you see a little bit of fluid around between the cells and between the cells and the zona pellucida, and that's the fluid matrix in which the rest of the cells will live and have their being. But the zona pellucida is really providing the structure at this point. But you get to 4 cells, 8 cells. In fact, you get to a whole sphere of cells as it goes further down the fallopian tube and into the uterus. And you still have the zona pellucida around it, but somewhere around day 10, the zona pellucida begins to disintegrate and go off. And what you end up with is these cells expand into a blastosphere, which is a sphere of cells. Now I can't do a sphere here on the thing, but essentially we had a water balloon of the individual cells. Now we have a water balloon of a whole bunch of cells. This is called the blastosphere. And this is much bigger than the original bunches of cells within the zona pellucida. And what happens with this blastosphere of cells is that it begins to, these cells on the edge kind of put out pseudopods, and they pull themselves in to create a kind of, I don't know, a donut or something. So these cells are putting out pseudopods and pulling from the inside, and it begins to make a dent in this blastosphere and pulls it closer and closer and closer to the other end. So you're almost making a donut or something, but it goes all the way through to where it touches the other side. What you end up with is a balloon like this. I get my best stuff at a toy store. This balloon has a hole all the way through the middle. And that's essentially what we are, is a hot dog with a hole through the middle, or an elongated bagel. This ends up being our digestive tract. So we are kind of a water balloon with a hole through the middle, from mouth to anus. And so what you're seeing here is that these cells invaginate in here until we get a kind of cup-shaped thing, like that. And then finally, these break through to the other side, and you end up with what I was just showing you, this kind of torus-shaped thing with a hole through the middle. Yeah? And what ends up happening here is that we get a triple layer arrangement. A layer on the top, a layer in the middle, and a layer on the bottom. And these are called, they're obviously touching each other, these are called the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. Now, at this point, these cells are beginning to specialize. The ectoderm will end up forming our skin and our brain and our nervous system and other stuff, and the mesoderm will form our muscles and connective tissues, and the endoderm will form the epithelial lining of things, like the lining of the digestive tract. But my point at the moment is that as soon as you have these 3 layers, I've put them apart here just so you can see the 3 layers, but they of course would be touching each other. And what you're looking at, if you're looking at the organism this way, is a cut through the organism in a transverse section. So at this point, when you have specialized cells, ectodermal, mesodermal, and endodermal cells, suddenly at this point, it makes a difference what the spatial relationships are among the cells. It really didn't make much difference here what the relationships are with the cells, because they're all the same. They're all carbon copies of each other. But now, when you start getting specialized, and from here on in, they're just going to get more and more specialized. They're all the specialized different kinds of muscle cells, cardiac and skeletal and smooth and slow twitch and fast twitch, and all the different kinds of nerves and all the different kinds of connective tissues and epithelial cells. It's just going to get more and more specialized, and the spatial arrangement is going to get more and more important. So here you have in the middle of the mesoderm, you get this kind of thickening, which is going to end up being our backbone, and on either side of it you have a piece called the mesenchyme, which suddenly migrates out and puts cells all through all three layers. Again, all three layers would be pretty much together. Okay? And these cells start to secrete little fibers outside the cells. These fibers are called reticular fibers because they're made out of a protein called reticulin. But later, all of this fibrous material of reticulin will be replaced by collagen, and that is the collagen net that we're working with in myofascial work. So it's really common for us to say to divide anatomy up. We're back to this parts and wholes thing. We divide anatomy up into the plantar fascia and the central tendon of the diaphragm and the thoracicolumbar fascia and the Achilles tendon, etc. But what we're looking at here is something that is, in fact, in reality, unitary. Unitary from top to toe and from birth to death. This net is what we're looking at. When we look at the myofascial meridians, we are looking at particular meridians that go through this net. I'd like to just complete this for a minute by looking at what happens to these three layers. You have the mesoderm here, and it's kind of like the tuna fish in the middle of an overstuffed sandwich. It starts bulging and falling out of the sides like this. This is how the cells begin to grow. And the endodermal cells are bent by this growth into something like this. And the ectodermal cells are also bent something like this by the growth of the mesoderm. And the mesoderm continues to grow out and around and out and around until it comes and joins in the front of the organism. And the mesoderm also continues to grow out and around the ectoderm, but the ectoderm is a little smarter than the endoderm. It has this little piece that's coming out like that. So whereas, just to carry this over a little farther, whereas the mesoderm comes around here and completely surrounds the endoderm into a tube. That, by the way, is your gut tube. It goes from your mouth all the way down to your anus. The mesoderm comes around here and pinches off a piece of the ectoderm here, so that what you end up with is two pieces of ectoderm outside and pinched off inside a tube. And this, except in cases of spina bifida, comes together and joins back here and provides the muscles of the back and the back of the backbone. The superficial part of the ectoderm comes around here and forms the skin. So here what you see is the general vertebrate body plan and how this comes out of the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. The mesodermal structures, which form all the myofasciae, are in the middle, spreading out around the two organic structures. Now, I've made them both tubes. This one is obvious that it's a tube. It starts at your mouth and comes out at the anus, and that's the digestive tube. It's got the liver and the pancreas and all the other organs that go along with it. This tube is your brain and your spinal cord. It may not be so obvious that it's a tube, but the tube is open in the ventricles of the brain and open in the spinal canal all the way down. And you've heard it said that the skin is the outer surface of the brain, and you can see how true this is. The nerves grow from the brain out through the muscles and the bones to the skin. So the skin and the brain are the same stuff. Just one is the outer surface of the other. So what we're going to be looking at here is how the mesodermal structure holds this together. You can still see this basic plan, anatomical plan, in our body today. If you understand, of course, that you're looking at the body this way, then you can see that this central piece right here corresponds to the center of the two circles there. And growing out from it, the mesoderm grows out around until it meets in the front, and when it does so, it surrounds all the organs, the heart and the lungs up here, and the esophagus, and all the digestive organs, the liver and the pancreas, etc., and the sexual organs down here, in one big ventral cavity. It's called the ventral cavity here. It involves the thorax and the abdomen and the pelvis. Similarly, in the back, the mesoderm is from the central backbone, growing out around the muscles and the bones here, forming the neural arch and forming the skull, the neurocranium, and protecting the central nervous system, the organic material of the nerves back here. So that what you have is this is a dorsal cavity back here. So that original fascial net that we saw that appears around day 14 is also still here. It surrounds every organ with a bag. There's fascia through every organ. Those bags are attached to the spine here. The brain and spinal cord are surrounded by fascia in the form of the pia mater and the dura mater, the meninges, and those are attached to the skull and the sacrum and along the spine. And the whole net is still there, except for, say, the open lumens of the blood vessels and the alimentary canal. And you can fray this net with age, you can slice it with the surgeon's knife, or you can tear it through injury, but the fascial net remains unitary from the birth to death and from top to toe. So even though we need to learn anatomy in terms of parts, and Lord knows you do need to know the parts, we tend to think about it as separate parts, like the Achilles tendon, the plantar fascia, the central tendon of the diaphragm. It's good to remember, thinking back on this embryology, it's good to remember that the reality is the unity of the net. The parts are just human-made inventions for analyzing it, for convenience. But the actual reality is the unity of the net. Now let's go look and see how this fascial net actually looks. The connective tissue is the most amazingly versatile tissue. If you went to HQ and bought all the things that you'd need to make a body, the connective tissue makes all those things by having a variety of fibers and a variety of substances that surround the fibers to make all these different tissues, like bone that has collagen, connective tissue running through it, and then the calcium around it, and cartilage that goes on joints, and all the fat and the fascia that goes around the muscles. It's really good to look at this in animal tissue, because if you look at the fresh animal tissue, you can see how it slides on each other and how it works much more easily than you can in tissue that has been preserved with formaldehyde, which is true of cadavers. It's great to look at cadavers, but you can learn a lot by looking at the animal connective tissue. So, for instance, these are tendons here, which you can see are pulling on the muscles, and as we move it back and forth, perhaps you can see here that this is sliding. And if you put your fingers on it, you guys, you can feel the quality of the tissue and how that tissue slides. So that everything that you're looking at here, except for the muscle, the red muscle tissue itself, is connective tissue, and you can even see in under here how you can get between one layer and the other, because the whole thing is layered. And the fascia that's in the muscle there will go into the tendon will go into the bone, and so forth. And if we got down into the joint here, you can't see it, but I can feel it, and you guys can feel it, the kind of synovial fluid that's a bit like egg white that provides the lubricant. That too is a form of connective tissue. So it's good to look at the animal tissue because it's fresher and more close to what fascia is really like in the body. But now let's go look at some slides of fascia as it appears in the human body. Don't forget to wash your hands before we get back to the class. Okay, so now let's look at some slides of fascia as it occurs in a human being, with the advantage that we're really looking at slides from a human being, and the disadvantage that we're looking at fascia that has been treated with formaldehyde, with formalin, so that it doesn't look as natural. However, I think it'll help us out anyway, especially this picture by my friend and rolfer Ron Thompson, who teased up some muscle fibers so that you can see the endomysium, the fascia, the collagen, the connective tissue. I'm using all those words interchangeably. that runs in between the muscle fibers. Muscle is like hamburger. It can't pull on anything without this fascial net, which is like cotton candy, a fish net, this tensile structure that holds each muscle cell in place, and this is the stuff that's going to form into a tendon when the muscle runs out and run down towards the bone, and this is the stuff that will form the periosteum. But you're just seeing part of this continual net as it exists within the muscle here. And here you can see overlapping layers of fascia, and I include this slide because you can see along here the lines where there's extra tension so that the fascia has formed in thicker ways, whereas you can see it going through here, somewhat like strapping tape that you use at the post office, and you can see some of the overlapping lines going in the opposite direction. Here we have a client, well, I guess this client is standing up, so that you can see the back muscles here, and over here you can see the abdominal fasciae coming around and joining up to the transverse processes in the back. I wanted you to see how the various layers of fascia can interlink with each other so that you actually get an interwoven link, so that when somebody says, well, you should go crosswise across the fibers because you should be cross-fiber fiction, well, that still doesn't tell you what direction to move, because there are all kinds of directions within the fascial net. And this one shows us, can you tell where we are? A little hard, isn't it? That's the iliotibial band that goes down the outside of the leg. So that somebody's cut into the fascia. What you're seeing here is the fat that's on the surface of the body that's usually taken off in dissection, but here it was left on. And the iliotibial band was cut and resected with the hemostat. But what I'd like you to see is, one, how strong this baby is coming down through there, and two, that there are fibers going vertically along the iliotibial band, but at the same time there are many fibers going horizontally, which would be going around the thigh, the fascia lata that goes around the thigh. This slide shows us the sternum, the breastbone, and you can see just right out at the edges of the slide, you can see the beginning of the pectoral muscles. And what you see going here are the fibers that go across from one side to the other. And I ask you to notice that these fibers here are stronger on this leg of this X than these fibers here on this leg of the X. The suggestion would be here that this person was left-handed, or used their left hand more strongly than their right, so that they create extra strain coming down along here, and the fascial system of the body responds by laying down extra fiber along that line. That's the same kind of thing that happens posturally. If you have a twist in your body, that's going to put strains through your body in different areas, and your body will lay down fascia, lay down collagen to resist those strains. Here, can you tell where this is? This is difficult. This is inside the head. What you're looking at here is the falx cerebri, the piece of fascia that separates the two hemispheres of your brain. And you can see that most of it here is arranged like a fan, and the fan's going around here, which is going around the bottom edge of that piece of fascia. The skull is up here. But look back here. Look at that extra fascia coming along here. There is a line of strain through this person's falx where the person's system has laid down this extra fascia to meet that strain. Now, this is no little piece of saran wrap that goes between the two parts of your brain. It suggests that there's really a lot of strain on that fascia, which coincides with the kind of thing that we've been learning from investigating the craniosacral therapy and the craniosacral pulse. Now, this slide is really quite important to the anatomy trains. What you're looking at here is the junction between two muscles, and in this case they're interdigitating on the ribs, and the next muscle is taking off from there. And what I want you to notice here is that some of the fascia is coming down and stopping on the ribs, and some of it passes right through and joins the next fascia of the next muscle. So when we're talking about the myofasciae, the myo part might stop, but the fasciae doesn't. So we'd call this a station on the anatomy train, and here's the track running right through. You can also see how the blood vessels and the nerves, although you can't see the nerves on this slide, the blood vessels and nerves use the fascia as a kind of track, as a scaffolding, and they hang on to the fascia as they distribute themselves throughout the tissue. So this, if you keep the concept of how the fascia is continuous, then the idea of these myofascial continuities becomes easier to swallow. Of course, they aren't really ribbons, these myofascial meridians. I'm going to lay them out as ribbons because they're easy to see, and the ribbons that I'm going to lay out are very common lines of pull that you see in the body, but it's really layers, like the ecto, endo, and mesodermal layers. These are mesodermal layers of fascia from the origami of the embryology. And here in this slide you can see some of those layers done up in blue, separating, say, the kidneys from the psoas, and here's a line separating the psoas from the quadratus lumborum. This is a slice through the lower backs, but the blue lines here show you some of the fascial planes and how they divide themselves into layers. And this actually is a human thigh. It has been modified here by putting glycerin over it. That's why it looks so lifelike, but don't worry, we didn't take it off anybody who was alive, even though it looks that way. What I'd like you to see here is how the fascia is layered through the body. This is the stuff that we work with. The first layer, which you can only see as a little white line here, is the dermis, and that's the layer that comes with your skin. It's just like carpet backing. So every time you pick up your skin, you pick up that dermal layer with you. And the reason you can pick up your skin is because of this next subcutaneous layer, which is the layer that's full of fat and white blood cells and infection-fighting cells in general. So that layer has a very loose fibrous network to it. So it's for that reason that you can pick up your skin. And if you come to some place and you try to pick up your skin and it's not so easy, that's because that subcutaneous layer is more tightly woven or hammered down onto the one beneath it. This layer is, on average, don't crucify me, thicker in women than in men, so that's why in general women are softer than men, is because this layer is thicker. This layer here is the first layer that we really think about as structural body workers, and it's the superficial fascia. It is, if you like, the body leotard, or a plastic bag that goes right up over the whole body and gets tied at the top. This is the layer that really keeps us in the shape that we're in and determines our postural set. Inside that layer is the next layer, quite thin here, is the so-called epimysium, the outer layer of the muscle fascia, what people keep thinking about when they say myofascia, but all of these layers are fascia. So then there would be fascia through the muscle, as we saw in the first slide of this series, all that individual cotton candy in between the muscle fibers, and then you can see a layer of fascia right here, this white line. This is an intermuscular septum. Now, if I stuck my fingers down into that intermuscular septum here, half that white line would go with this muscle, and half the white line would go with this muscle. So it's been, classical anatomists have just considered it as being this outer fascial layer going with the muscles, but structural body workers consider it to be a layer of its own. You can think of a grapefruit. If I took the grapefruit and I cut it through its equator, as if I was going to have it for breakfast, I would see all these walls between the sections of the grapefruit. But if I peeled the grapefruit and then divided the sections, you'd see that half of that wall would go with one section of the grapefruit and half of that wall would go with the other section of the grapefruit. So is it one wall or it's two walls? It's both. So in considering it like the wall of the grapefruit when I cut it through the equator, this structure here, this intermuscular septum, is a fascial structure that we can consider in terms of its length, its ability to move relative to itself, relative to the things that are around it, and we do. The next layer down of fascia is just peeled back a little bit here, and that's the periosteum. That's the kind of saran wrap coating that goes around each of the bones, and it's the layer in which the muscles actually attach. Very rarely, sometimes, the hamstrings a little bit, the psoas definitely, some of the other muscles actually attach into the fabric of the bone itself. But most of the muscles attach to the periosteum. So that's the next layer of fascia. And the final layer of fascia, I guess I should say connective tissue, because it's not really fascia, but it is a connective tissue, is bone. The bone is filled with collagen just the same as the rest of the connective tissue. It's just that bone has a much harder ground substance, or this calcium apatite that we see around it. So look, we've got 7 layers of fascia. 1, the dermis. 2, the subcutaneous layer, the areolar layer or the fat layer. 3, the superficial fascia. 4, the myofascia around the outside of the muscles. 5, intermuscular septa. 6, the periosteum. And 7, the bone. Now, it's not always 7 layers. It's in some places you have lots more layers, and in some places a few less. But that generally gives you a kind of summary of how the fascial layers are laid out in the body. And this amazing image, which shows about the same part of the body, but with the muscle tissue removed so that you can see these intermuscular septa and the whole fascial net between the femur and the skin, this was created by my colleague Jeff Lynn using data from the Visual Human Data Project. And when this is complete, we will have a picture of the fascial man that we were talking about earlier.
A sailboat must be one of the best of human inventions, going through the water using nothing but the wind. But we didn't come out here for an ecology lesson. We came out to learn something about the body, and a sailboat can help teach us about how the body stands up. We're used to looking at structures like the lighthouse in the building behind me, where you've got one brick piled on top of another brick, all sitting on solid main granite, so that it's a continuous compression structure all the way down from the top of the lighthouse to the ground. And we think of our skeleton as being the same way, the head piled on top of the thorax, and the chest on top of the pelvis, and the pelvis on top of the legs. But you know, if you disappeared all of the soft tissue, the skeleton would fall to the ground. And a sailboat is a little bit instructed like that. A body is more like a sailboat than a lighthouse. The mast is kind of like a bone, or a series of bones like the spine, and the stays, the shrouds, are really like the myofasciae of the body, offering extra support in a tensional way, not just a compressional way. If you suddenly disappeared all these stays off the sailboat, the mast would fall down under the pressure of the sail. You really need these guys on this side to keep it tight. If we went over and waggled the shrouds on the other side, you'd see that they were very loose. But when we turn the boat the other way, they'll be tight again. Same thing is true of the body. If you look at this structure here, this is kind of taking the sailboat idea to an extreme. These tensegrity structures were invented by Kenneth Nelson, a sculptor, and popularized by Buckminster Fuller, a designer in the 1960s. It works off a whole new geometry. But if you look here carefully, you'll see that the dowels are supported in a balanced way without even touching each other by the balance of the rubber bands. And the body is very much the same way. If you disappeared all these rubber bands, all the dowels would clatter to the floor. And the same thing is true of the body. If you disappeared all the soft tissue, all the bones would clatter to the floor. We have this kind of illusion because we look at those skeletons in the classroom. They're all wired together, so we think of the skeleton as a solid framework on which the muscles work, but it's not that way at all. The bones float in the soft tissue in the same way that these dowels float inside the rubber bands. Now, when you start to look at these structures, they have a bunch of interesting properties that are very much like the properties bodies have. If I create a shortness in this part of the soft tissue, you can see that the whole structure deforms in a way. Let's see if I can keep it still enough here so that you can see that. See how the whole structure goes? So I could have a shortness over in this part of the body and be complaining of pain over in this part where it's changing. The same thing is true of structural body work. You can have somebody saying, oh, the pain's in my neck. And I start to work over here and they say, no, the pain's up here in my neck. I say, well, that may be where you're hurting, but this is where the problem is. This is where the shortness is. Kind of bone manipulation techniques like chiropractic and osteopathy tend to look at knocking the bones back into place, which can also work to restore balance to the structure of the body. But long-term chronic postural difficulties are often set in the soft tissue in such a way that resetting the bones simply won't last. The soft tissue will again pull the bones out of place. So what we're looking at here in terms of what we want is an even, balanced tone across the myofasciae of the body so that the bones will stay lightly, easily floating in place. The Anatomy Trains theory is looking at how the myofasciae of the body cover the bones, not just this muscle going from here to here, but in the series of continuous rubber bands that work their way around the human structure, which is a good deal more complicated than this structure, so that we can achieve the kind of balance that leads to ease and harmony and lack of pain.
So the traditional view of the body, in fact, the view espoused by my teacher, Ida Rolf, sees the body as a bunch of blocks, and she had the bunch of blocks inside the plastic bag there, and it's a question of how do you arrange the blocks inside the plastic bag to get a natural alignment of the body. And that's a powerful image, but you can get even more powerful about the effectiveness of myofascial work if you look at the geometry, at the balance in the geometry between tension and compression. So, next slide, please. If you consider the body as a bunch of blocks, then you want to line those blocks up, boom, 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 on the gravity line. And if you're leaning back, it'll go into tension on the front. And if you lean forward, it'll go into tension on the back. So we begin to see the guy wires that are holding the skeleton up as beginning to be important, but we can get even a little more sophisticated than that. Following on that traditional way of looking at the body, if you look here, what we have is a block of wood sitting on a horizontal block of wood going down to the two, and the lines that are drawn on there are showing how the stresses go. And of course that's very similar to how the spine sits on the pelvis, sits on the legs, and you can see in the lines of stress drawn in there, you can see the sacrum defined in the compression here, that kind of triangle. You can see the pelvic floor defined in the tension that goes underneath, and you can even see the femoral heads defined in the compression that's coming up from the other legs. You can see a very similar thing here and an actual cut through the pelvis, how the sacrum sits down on this block of wood, which sets down into there, and both the soft and the bony tissues arrange themselves in that way. But now here's a little more sophisticated in the sense of the balance between tension and compression. More sophisticated in this case is 1938. You see the body segments lined up here, but the MCs are the muscle centers. The muscle centers counterbalance the tendency of the blocks to curl up into the fetal position, and so there's one on the bottom of the foot, one on the back of the leg, one on the front of the thigh, in the butt and the lower back, the chest and the neck. And the figure on the right gives us an example of what can happen if that starts to get out of balance. What you get instead is tightness in the shins, tightness in the hamstrings, tightness in the groin, tightness in the mid-back, tightness in the throat. Okay, so this slide shows us what we were looking at on the boat, but more precisely, exactly how the mast of the spine is arranged like a sailboat. If you look at the boat there, you have the two shrouds coming from the front of the boat up to the top of the mast, and then in our case the scalenes going down to the gaff of the first rib, and the rib cage is like the sail, and then the sail is from the boom, which would be the bottom of the rib cage, is sheeted back to the hull of the pelvis by the rectus abdominis. So we really are arranged like a sailboat, and that allows the mast to be thinner and lighter than it otherwise would have to be. But it's still a continuous mast from the head down to the sacrum, and ours is a segmented spine. So let's look at something even a little more dependent on the tension. This is a beautiful structure constructed by a German architect named Otto Frey. What you're looking at here is almost like the stem of a plant. In fact, he was looking at how do sunflowers turn and face the sun as the sun changes in the sky all day. And he came up with this kind of structure where what you've got is a series of independent segments that fit into each other like a ball into a socket, or one golf tee into another would be the closest thing I could think of. And around each golf tee is a plexiglass circle which they cut into triangles with holes drilled through it. And say you start in with 12 lines going up through this thing. The 12th one ends at the last circle. But the 11 keep on going through, and then the 11th one is tied off here, and the 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th, 6th, 5, 4, until you get to the top one, which only has that last cable, which has gone all the way up the inside here. Now, you have a mess of cables down here. You have 36 cables. I did 12. I don't know how many this is, but I'm doing 12 for a reason. You have 36 cables down here. You've got to tie up all those cables around drums, but if you did that by winding this drum, this drum, this drum, this drum, this drum, you could take this tent mast and put it anywhere you wanted it to be in any shape. And our back does the same thing. You kind of get in under the cupboard under the sink, and then you look around till you can see the nut, and then you go back that way so you can get your arm in, and then you put your arm in and get the drain off the bottom of the thing. There are muscles like this, the iliocostalis in your back, that do exactly this kind of thing from rib to rib to rib, and allow your back to stabilize itself in whatever godforsaken position you have to get it into to do whatever chore you have to do on a Sunday afternoon. So this more approaches what a spine is in terms of the balance between tension and compression, because here first, this is the first structure that we've seen that if we cut all the wires, it would fall down. And that's the same is true of your spine. And we can go even a little farther down that road. These structures are called tensegrity structures, and were invented by Kenneth Snelson, an artist, and popularized by Buckminster Fuller. And if you look at this structure, you can see that none of the sticks are touching each other. They're all held in place by the balance of the rubber bands, or wires, or whatever they used here. This is quite an amazing structure, and as you can see, it's a mast, kind of like the spine, and none of those wooden things are touching each other. They stay right where they are on the balance of the rubber bands. So I brought a couple of these models in for you to look at. Why don't you play with this, pass it around, and I'll talk to the people in video land with this one. As you can see, the bones, the dowels, are floating in the balance provided by the rubber bands. In fact, you could say that the dowels are pushing out against the rubber bands, and that's the conception of the bones in the myofascial meridians theory. And these rubber bands that go continually around the whole structure are the myofasciae, the myofascial meridians. And where they tack down to the bones are what we've been calling the stations. This is another way of looking at the whole thing. These structures have a number of properties that are a bit like bodies. For one thing, if you put stress into this structure, for instance, if this was a whiplash, or this was an injury of some sort, you see how the strain is taken by the whole structure. It's not right where the impact comes. The impact is distributed through the myofasciae all over the structure, and of course these rubber bands are the pathway by which the strain is distributed. The other thing is, look at these two dowels here that are parallel to you. If I push these two dowels together, the other two dowels are going to go apart, right? The ones that are parallel to you, watch. As I push these dowels together, the other dowels come together too. You can see it that way also. Bodies act the same way. If you put strain and stress into one part of the whole body shrinks. It shrinks in height, it shrinks in width, it shrinks in depth. It doesn't have to shrink in all three of them, but it can. And as you unravel the body, as you unwind the body, as you let go of the strain in the myofasciae, what you see is an expansion that happens all over the body. You get an expansion in width, an extension in depth, and an extension of height that Rolfers tend to call lift. The other thing about these structures that's interesting is if you take and you put strain in one piece of the myofasciae, you might see a problem emerging somewhere else, right? Not anywhere as near where the problem is, because as the strain takes itself around the structure, the pain may end up somewhere else. So that's another thing in myofascial work that we look at is you might be working quite far from the site of injury or the site of pain. Okay, so just to reiterate, the reason for this journey through geometry is to see that the dowels are like the bones and that they push the myofasciae apart. And the myofascia are like the rubber bands that are holding the bones in place. And in this conception, and the power of this conception is that you can see how balancing the myofasciae will set where the skeleton sits. So that we can really powerfully change the whole structure, myofascial and skeletal, by working with the myofascial system. In the journey of discovery about the myofascial meridians, I began to think about it as a game, and I called the game The Anatomy Trains, because there's certain things about trains that gives us insight as to how this game works. The first thing is that the tracks of myofascial pull through the body, just like train tracks, need to go pretty much in the same direction. You can't make radical changes of direction and still have a line of pull that goes through the body. So rule number one is, of an anatomy train, you can't make radical changes of direction. You have to keep going in the same direction. Secondly, you can't have one set of tracks crossing right over another set of tracks or the trains would collide. So you can't, in the same way as if you have a line of pull going through the body, if it meets another fascial plane going opposite to it, you can't have a line of pull through that plane. So that's the second rule. You can't have one plane of fascia crossing through the other plane and still have the line of pull. Another rule of the anatomy trains game, it's actually not so much of a rule but just a condition of the fascia, is that the fascial planes or fascial lines of pull are able to divide, kind of like a Y or kind of like this switch here, so that one fascial plane can divide into two and create two separate lines of pull, and conversely two separate lines of fascia can come together and blend into one fascial plane. We'll see that a number of times throughout the body. Another way in which this train image is helpful to us is thinking about tracks and stations. The tracks are like the myofascia. They run continuously through the body. But the muscles go from station to station, from origin to insertion. And we've been thinking of muscles of just going from the origin to the insertion, and as if that was the only line of pull. But once you start thinking about the myofascial meridians, the myofascial continuities, those are just stations along this continuous track that runs right through the body. So we'll be talking about this in terms of where the tracks run and where are the stations on the tracks. So that's another rule, and I guess the last thing that we find here is that we have expresses and locals. Just like the subway in Boston, the express train covers several stations before it stops, and the locals just go from station to station. Let's go back to the classroom and I'll explain to you what I mean about expresses and locals. Okay, so one last way in which this train metaphor is useful to us, but we need the skeleton to explain it, is the idea of expresses and locals. You know, the express train only stops at the major stops and the locals stop at every stop along the way. So looking at just an example in the body, if you take the biceps muscle, for example, and you look at how it's stretched, if you figure out how many joints it's crossing, it crosses 3 joints Do you know how to do that? Figure out how many joints it's crossing? You let your fingers do the walking. So if I start here at the coracoid process and I walk around, I walk onto the humerus, and I walk down to the ulna, and then I walk across to the radius. So it's crossing the shoulder joint, the elbow joint, and the radio-ulnar joint. So that means that it has three actions. It kind of flexes and adducts the humerus, and it flexes the elbow, and it supinates the hand, the radio-ulnar joint, like that. So if we look underneath it, if we look underneath the biceps, what we're going to find is a series of locals that cover the same territory, singling out each action. So if you look here, from the coracoid process down to the arm, you have the coracobrachialis muscle, which adducts and flexes the arm. And then, taking right off from that, you look in your anatomy books, is the brachialis, which comes down here to the ulna, and then from the ulna over to the radius, you have the supinator. So the supinator is doing the supinating, the brachialis is doing the flexing of the elbow, coracobrachialis is flexing and adducting the arm, and as you can see, the express goes, whoops, the express that covers many joints is on the outside. The locals, which cover the individual joint, are deeper on the inside. We'll see a few exceptions to that in the lower arm and lower leg, but generally that's the pattern across the body. The express is more superficial, the locals are deeper. Okay, so that's the rules of the game, and so now let's go look at a route map of the train lines in general, and then we'll take the anatomy of each line on in succession. Well, we brought you out here by the harbor, picked up a fish from the market so that I could show you just where these lines exist, because they've got a long heritage from the very beginning of the vertebrates. And so we can see where the kind of route map of the myofascial meridians on this fish. We're going to see one which we'll call the superficial back line that will trace down either side of the midline all the way down the back. We're going to see another one, the superficial front line, which will trace all the way down the fish in the front. We're going to see a lateral line that goes all the way down the side of the body. We're going to see one that traces around the body. Now, I'm not a fish anatomist, so I'm not exactly sure, but there is, whether there's a spiral line in the fish, but there is a spiral line in the humans that we're going to see cross right over the midline and spiral around the body like that from head to foot, except we don't have any feet here either. There is one more line that I'd like to show you on the fish, but I have to get the fish cleaned first. These guys are good, and they're fast too. So, aside from these other lines, the last one is the deep front line. The deep front line passes right up the front, or down the front, the direction doesn't matter, of the vertebral bodies, with the ribs coming around it. You can see it here, all the way from the bottom of the skull all the way down the tailbone. You can see it's about halfway through the body, but it's in the front of the spine, so we'll call it the deep front line. So, we are having a lot of fun here. But we've been at this for a while, so why don't you take a break, get a glass of water, have a stretch, and we'll go back to the classroom and take on the lines one by one.
So, we've reached the end of Fascial Tensegrity, Tape 1 of the Anatomy Trains Myofascial Meridians series. In this part, we've learned about the important roles of connective tissues and the development of the fascial network, and we've unfolded and explained the complex origami of the fascia's multi-layer arrangement. We've described how the relationship between the bones and the myofasciae can be seen as a tensegrity structure, and how the myofascial meridians describe the continual tensile line running through the body. To make it fun, we compared these myofascial continuities to train lines with tracks and stations, and used this metaphor to present the rules and the route map that these meridians of structure follow. In the next tape of this series, the myofascial meridians, we'll present each of the 12 myofascial meridians in detail. All along the way, we'll demonstrate how this new view can be applied to assessment and treatment. By understanding the specifics of these body-wide lines of transmission, you'll be able to address stubborn local myofascial pain problems by unwinding global postural patterns. More applications of the Anatomy Trains idea to assessment and treatment can be found on our Anatomy Trains technique videos, in the Anatomy Trains book, or via our classes. Thanks for watching.
Eyes are awake now, worlds in view, one and